Hello everyone, welcome to today's Sutta study. We will start with the Namo Tassa as usual. Feel free to join in if you like. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. So, welcome everyone again. Today we are continuing our mini-series about the friends from Kassapa Buddha's time who became outstanding monks or outstanding renunciants. Not all of them were monks in our Buddha's time. Last time we talked about Sabya, and this time we are talking about someone else called Pukusati. So some of you might be familiar with the sutta. It's an extremely beautiful sutta, I think, which is the Datu-Vibhanga Sutta. This is the sutta that the Buddha gave to Pukusati. This is Majjhima Nikaya number 140. And to recap briefly for those who didn't join in last time or who don't remember anymore, we are having a mini-series about a group of monks, 7 monks who were members of the Sangha in Kassapa Buddha's time. And back then they were extrememly committed and dedicated practitioners, and they went through a lot of hardship to try and attain arahantship. And of that group of 7 monks, one of them actually attained arahantship, and one of them became an anagami, a non-returner, and 5 of them did not attain anything, and they just starved to death and passed away without any attainment. So if you want to hear the full story, you should check out last week's video. But those 5 people are now became very outstanding practitioners in our Buddha's time. And so those 5 are Sabya, who we talked about last time, Pukusati, who we're going to talk about today, and then it's also Dabamala-Putta, Kumara Kassapa, and Bahya Daurachirya, who we are going to talk about in the next few weeks. So all of them have very interesting and very beautiful suttas. And today we are talking about Majjhima Nikaya number 140, the Datu-Vibhanga Sutta. But before we start reading the sutta, I think we should look a little bit into the biography of Pukusati. Of course, that biography, we don't find this in the early Buddhist texts because there isn't much biographical material in general. But we do find it in the commentary, so take it with a grain of salt. But I do think it's interesting to know this when we read the sutta. So Pukusati was not born in India. He was actually the king of Takasila, and Takasila is a city in the region of Gandhara. So Gandhara is in modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan, so quite far away from the place where the Buddha was teaching. So Pukusati did not have any contact with the Buddha directly, and he didn't have any contact with any Sangha members, so any monastics or even any traveling lay people. But Pukusati was, because he was a king, he was friends with King Bimbisara of Magadha. And of course, King Bimbisara of Magadha was a very, very strong supporter of the Buddha. King Bimbisara already supported the Buddha before he became enlightened. So he already met the Buddha when he was still a bodhisattva and asked the Buddha to come back and teach him once he would attain full enlightenment. And then he also became a stream enterer and a very strong supporter of the Buddha. And so one day, King Bimbisara received very expensive, very precious gifts from his friend King Pukusati from Takasila. And because the gift was so expensive, King Bimbisara realized that he didn't have any other material possession that was of equal value to send back as a gift to King Pukusati. So King Bimbisara thought the most valuable thing that he has in his realm is the Dhamma of the Buddha. So he should send that to King Pukusati. So he, according to the commentarial story, he took a golden plate and he had the 3 refuges inscribed on it and the 37 Bodhipakya Dhammas, which are the 37 wings to awakening, and a few other Dhamma concepts. And then he had that wrapped in a very expensive kind of whatever packaging and a very expensive box and sent it to King Pukusati. And when King Pukusati received that golden plate and he read the inscription, he was so touched, he was so moved by just reading those small snippets of Dhamma that he immediately gave away his kingdom. He shaved his hair, he put on a robe, and he walked out and became a renunciate and tried to find the Buddha. So we can see that the seeds that he planted in the past life with Kassapa Buddha were extremely strong. Even though he didn't have any contact directly with the Buddha or with any Sangha member, just reading a few words on an inscription was strong enough for him to awaken that potential, that karmic potential, and to enable him to give up everything in search of the Buddha and in search of the Dhamma. And then he wandered towards, he thought that the Buddha was staying at Kosala, and he wandered towards Kosala. And at this point is where the story picks up in the sutta. So I think at this point we can now start reading today's sutta. Again, this is Majjhima Nikaya number 140. I have put a link in the description box and also a link in the live chat. And we will be reading from Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, so feel free to read along if you want. So this sutta is called the Exposition of the Elements, or Datu-Vibhanga Sutta, and it is as follows. Thus have I heard, on one occasion, the Blessed One was wandering in the Magadhan country and eventually arrived at Rajagaha. So here we see, normally the standard passage of introduction is the Buddha was wandering with a large sangha of bhikkhus, and sometimes it's said that all of the other chief disciples were there, Sariputta, Moggallana, and many of the other people. But here on this occasion, it seems that the Buddha was wandering entirely alone. So it does seem that the Buddha wasn't always surrounded by a large crowd of people, that he also valued seclusion and valued being by himself. And then he went to the potter Bhagava and he said to him, "If it is not inconvenient for you, Bhagava, I will stay one night in your workshop." So the Buddha obviously being alone, and he seems to be traveling somewhat incognito. So he's not going to any of the big places in Rajagaha where the Sangha usually stays. He's not going to any of his usual supporters, but instead he goes to the potter and says, "I need a place to stay overnight. Can I stay at your place?" And the potter says, "It's not inconvenient for me, Venerable Sir, but there is a homeless one already staying there. If he agrees, then stay as long as you like, Venerable Sir." So here we see, it seems that the potter Bhagava wasn't really a Buddhist. If he was a Buddhist, he'd probably treat the Buddha quite differently. He wouldn't say to the Buddha, "Well, there's someone there. If that other person lets you stay, then that's fine. But if not, then find some other place to stay." It seems that the potter Bhagava is just somebody who likes to have renunciants around, who likes to have people of like any kind of spiritual group or any kind of spiritual practice around, not necessarily just Buddhist. Otherwise, he would treat the Buddha quite differently. And I think that we know that from other suttas. That was very common at the time, people making merit and just supporting ascetics and recluses in general. So this is what seems to be happening here. And also the potter Bhagava is quite considerate, and he says, "Well, if there's another person there, so this is my workshop, but still also check with the other person who's already staying there, whether he agrees or not." So he's quite considerate and trying to make sure everybody is okay with the arrangement. And so Now there was a clansman named Pukusati who had gone forth from the home life into homelessness out of faith in the Blessed One. And on that occasion, he was already staying in the potter's workshop. Then the Blessed One went to the Venerable Pukusati and said to him, "If it is not inconvenient for you, Bhikkhu, I will stay one night in the workshop." "The potter's workshop is large enough, friend. Let the Venerable One stay as long as he likes." So here we know that the person who is staying at the potter's workshop is Pukusati. And it's interesting here that Pukusati is described as somebody who has gone forth from the home life into homelessness. So normally we would think that that means at least Pabbaja ordination, so a proper Buddhist ordination. But we know that in Pukusati's case, he doesn't really have an ordination. And that's confirmed later on in the sutta when he asks to get Pabbaja and Upasampada. So both kinds of ordinations. So at this point, what the text says seems to just mean that he literally left his home and walked into the homelessness, like walked out into the wilderness, and he doesn't have an official kind of ordination. And it's also interesting that the Buddha calls him bhikkhu here, even though he doesn't have a proper ordination. And that's something that we find in many of the early suttas, that bhikkhu wasn't necessarily a technical term that applied only to Buddhist Sangha members like bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. But bhikkhu was just meant an alms mendicant of any kind of spiritual movement. So it wasn't specific to the Buddhist Sangha. It could be of any kind of ascetic practice. And of course, Pukusati, never having met any kind of Buddhist monastic before, doesn't recognize the Buddha at this point. And maybe he doesn't even recognize that the Buddha is a Buddhist monk. And so Pukusati just says, the workshop is large enough. You can stay as long as you like. And of course, he calls him friend. So clearly he doesn't recognize the Buddha. And then the Blessed One entered the potter's workshop, prepared a spread of grass at one end, and sat down, folding his legs crosswise, setting his body erect and establishing mindfulness in front of him. So the Buddha is meditating now, and then the Blessed One spent most of the night seated in meditation. And the Venerable Pukusati also spent most of the night seated in meditation. Then the Blessed One thought, "This clansman conducts himself in a way that inspires confidence. Suppose I were to question him." So now the Buddha notices that Pukusati is also doing a lot of very deep practices, especially meditation. And again, here we see how the seeds that Pukusati has planted in the past life under Kassapa Buddha are coming and supporting him in his practice now. Because Pukusati, having never met any Buddhist monastic or lay person, also doesn't have a teacher in meditation, obviously. So he just read those few Dhamma principles that were inscribed on that golden plate. And from that, apparently, he was able to spend most of the night in meditation. And for anybody who's actually practicing meditation, you can see that this is quite an unusual occurrence. Like usually, if you just start out Buddhist practice, it would be difficult to even do 10 minutes or 20 minutes. But staying up the whole night or most of the night doing meditation shows us that Pukusati is a really advanced practitioner already at this point, even though he doesn't have a teacher. And the Buddha is quite appreciative of what he can see there. And so he thinks that this is a person that's worthy of teaching or of learning more about. Like he becomes curious about Pukusati's background. And so he asked the Venerable Pukusati, "Under whom have you gone forth, Bhikkhu? Who is your teacher? Whose Dhamma do you profess?" And here, of course, the question, whose Dhamma do you profess? The word Dhamma here doesn't necessarily refer to Buddhist Dhamma. This could mean any kind of teaching of any kind of spiritual movement. So Dhamma isn't necessary, like in the early text, it doesn't necessarily mean just the Buddhist Dharma that we, like the way we use the word. In the early text, it's a much broader meaning. And Pukusati replies, "Friend, there is the recluse Gautama, the son of the Sakyans, who went forth from a Sakyan clan. Now a good report of that blessed Gautama has been spread to this effect. That blessed one is accomplished, fully enlightened, perfect in true knowledge and conduct, sublime, knower of worlds, incomparable, leader of persons to be tamed, teacher of gods and humans, enlightened, blessed. I have gone forth under that blessed one. That blessed one is my teacher. I profess the Dhamma of that blessed one. So, this is, of course, the Itipiso Bhagava Arahang, and so on, this standard description of the Buddha. And Pukusati now tells the Buddha that he is a student of the Buddha. The Buddha's reaction now, I think, is quite interesting. It's quite remarkable, because the Buddha still keeps up his incognito mode and doesn't reveal who he is. Instead, he tries to figure out how the misunderstanding came about. How can you be a bhikkhu, or how can you be a student of the Buddha without knowing who the Buddha is? So the Buddha asks, but bhikkhu, where is that blessed one, accomplished and fully enlightened, now living? And Pukusati says, there is, friend, a city in the northern country named Savatthi. The blessed one, accomplished and fully enlightened, is now living there. So Pukusati believes that the Buddha is actually in the country of Kosala, when obviously at the moment they're in the country of Magadha. And the Buddha says, but bhikkhu, have you ever seen that blessed one before? Would you recognize him if you saw him? And Pukasati says, no, friend, I have never seen that blessed one before, nor would I recognize him if I saw him. And I think this whole introduction, but especially this little exchange, is just so beautiful. This is one of my favorite suttas. And it's just so amazing to think that it was possible. If you live back in the time of the Buddha, you're just walking around, randomly staying in somebody's workshop overnight, and the door opens and the Buddha walks in and he meditates with you all night. And you have this one-on-one meeting with the Buddha. And how amazing would it be to have lived in that time and to have had these kind of experiences? And I just think it's so inspiring. And also the way the Buddha behaves here, being quite humble and just focusing on the Dhamma, not revealing his personality, not wanting to be worshipped, but just wanting to teach that person the Dhamma, recognizing the good qualities of that person and then trying to teach him the Dhamma. I think it's just a really amazing encounter that is described here in this sutta. And then the Blessed One thought, this clansman has gone forth from the home life into homelessness under me. Suppose I were to teach him the Dhamma. So the Buddha now just wants to teach him the Dhamma. The Buddha doesn't want him to worship him or doesn't want to reveal that he is this amazing big teacher. He's just really focusing on teaching Dhamma. And so the Blessed One addressed the Venerable Pukusati thus, Bhikkhu, I will teach you the Dhamma. Listen and attend closely to what I shall say. Yes, friend, the Venerable Pukusati replied. So we have to keep in mind that at this point, Pukusati still doesn't know that he's talking to a Buddhist monastic, much less that he's talking to the Buddha himself. So actually what Pukusati was looking for, getting teachings and meeting the Buddha, that is happening at the moment, but he doesn't know it. So presumably Pukusati at this point is just being polite. He's probably not that much interested in any random spiritual group's teaching. And so he doesn't know which spiritual group that other monk, the Buddha, belongs to. And he's probably just being polite and letting the other person talk about the teaching without knowing that he's now getting a detailed Dhamma teaching, exactly what he was looking for the whole time. But I think he'll notice that very soon, as we will see when the sutta progresses. And the Blessed One said this, Bhikkhu, this person consists of 6 elements, 6 spaces of contact, and 18 kinds of mental exploration. And he has 4 foundations. The tides of conceiving do not sweep over one who stands upon these foundations. And when the tides of conceiving no longer sweep over him, he is called a sage at peace. One should not neglect wisdom, should preserve truth, should cultivate relinquishment, and should train for peace. This is the summary of the exposition of the 6 elements. So here the Buddha is giving, as he does in many suttas, a brief summary of what he's going to talk about now. So this is obviously a rhetorical device so people can concentrate better when they know what's coming. So the Buddha starts with giving him some basic definitions of basic Dhamma principles, because Pukusati has never had proper teachings before. And then he's going into a very, very deep teaching. And this idea of the 4 foundations, so not neglecting wisdom, preserving truth, cultivating relinquishment, and training for peace. This is something which I believe is only found in this sutta here, nowhere else. And I think it's very beautiful. It's one of these amazingly beautiful, short, pithy statements that summarize the entire path in one sentence. And it's just extremely beautiful to have this whole path compressed into this one sentence: not neglecting wisdom, preserving truth, cultivating relinquishment, and training for peace. And of course, in the course of this sutta, the Buddha will expand on all of these 4 factors in more detail. And also the idea of the tides of conceiving that sweep over a person or no longer sweep over the person, and that person then being called a sage at peace. This is also very unique to this sutta and will also be explained. This kind of metaphor will also be explained in more detail later on. And I think especially these 2 points, the 4 foundations and that metaphor of the sage at peace, this is what makes this sutta so unique and makes it so beautiful. But the Buddha begins first by defining the few things that he mentioned in the beginning. And he says, "Bhikkhu, this person consists of 6 elements. So it was said, and with reference to what was this said? There are the earth element, the water element, the fire element, the air element, the space element, and the consciousness element. So it was with reference to this that it was said, Bhikkhu, this person consists of 6 elements." So these obviously are the very standard 6 elements: earth, water, fire, air, space, and consciousness. And as I mentioned, the Buddha is just introducing this because Pukusati doesn't have proper teachings, or hasn't had proper teachings so far. So he's trying to, Pukusati has all the karmic potential to properly understand this. So the Buddha can just give him a few definitions, and Pukusati can make use of that, and his mind is then prepared for the Buddha to give a very deep teaching. And the next paragraph serves the same purpose. The Buddha says, "Bhikkhu, this person consists of 6 bases of contact. So it was said, and with reference to what was this said? There are the base of eye contact, the base of ear contact, the base of nose contact, the base of tongue contact, the base of body contact, and the base of mind contact. So it was with reference to this that it was said, Bhikkhu, this person consists of 6 bases of contact." So these again are the standard 6 senses: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And so, of course, the 6 senses are bases for contact. That's how we experience the outside world, or even the internal world in the case of the mind sense. And then the Buddha says, "Bhikkhu, this person consists of 18 kinds of mental exploration. So it was said, and with reference to what was this said? On seeing a form with the eye, one explores a form productive of joy. One explores a form productive of grief. One explores a form productive of equanimity. On hearing a sound with the ear, on smelling an odor with the nose, on tasting a flavor with the tongue, on touching a tangible with the body, and on cognizing a mind object with the mind. One explores a mind object productive of joy. One explores a mind object productive of grief. One explores a mind object productive of equanimity. So it was with reference to this that it was said, Bhikkhu, this person consists of 18 kinds of mental exploration." So here now the Buddha is combining the 6 senses with the 3 kinds of feeling. which is painful, pleasant, and neutral feeling. And of course, 3 times 6 is 18. So we come to 18 kinds of mental exploration. And here we are for the feeling, we have painful, pleasant, and neutral if we talk about bodily feelings. But if we talk about the mental feelings, then these become the joyful feeling, the grieveful feeling, and the equanimous feeling, which are the mental counterparts of pleasurable, painful, and neutral. And here, because we're talking about mental explorations, of course, we are using the mental equivalents of the 3 kinds of feeling, combined with the 6 senses, and we come to 18 kinds of mental exploration. So, and then the Buddha says, Bhikkhu, this person has 4 foundations. So it was said, and with reference to what was this said? They are the foundation of wisdom, the foundation of truth, the foundation of relinquishment, and the foundation of peace. So it was with reference to this that it was said, Bhikkhu, this person has 4 foundations. One should not neglect wisdom, should preserve truth, should cultivate relinquishment, and should train for peace. So it was said, and with reference to what was this said. So now we are coming to the special teaching in this sutta, which is the 4 foundations. And now the Buddha is going to apply the Dhammic principles that he just introduced, especially the elements and so on, to the path of practice. Like, how do we practice with these sets of Dhamma teachings to actually not neglect wisdom, to preserve truth, to cultivate relinquishment, and to train for peace? So how do we use the theoretical concepts to actually make a practical path? So for the rest of the sutta, the Buddha is now going to explain those 4 foundations in a lot more detail, starting with the first one, which is not neglecting wisdom. So the Buddha says, how, Bhikkhu, does one not neglect wisdom? There are these 6 elements: the earth element, the water element, the fire element, the air element, the space element, and the consciousness element. So these are obviously the standard elements. And of these elements, the first 4 belong to the material world: the earth element, water, fire, and air. And of course, we're going to go through this in more detail in a minute. Then the space element, you could in some way say it belongs to the material world, but it's not. It doesn't belong to matter itself. This is the space that is in between matter. And again, we are going to come to this in a minute in more detail. And then, of course, the consciousness element, which encompasses everything that happens in the mental sphere. And now the Buddha explains in more detail how do we use these 6 elements to not neglect wisdom, or to actually develop wisdom. What, Bhikkhu, is the consciousness element? What, Bhikkhu, is the earth element? The earth element may be either internal or external. What is the internal earth element? Whatever internally belonging to oneself is solid, solidified, and clung to. That is head hairs, body hairs, nails, teeth, skin, flesh, sinews, bones, bone marrow, kidneys, heart, liver, diaphragm, spleen, lungs, intestines, mesentery, contents of the stomach, feces, or whatever else internally belonging to oneself is solid, solidified, and clung to. This is called the internal earth element. Now, both the internal earth element and the external earth element are simply earth element. And that should be seen as it actually is, with proper wisdom thus: this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. When one sees it thus, as it actually is, with proper wisdom, one becomes disenchanted with the earth element and makes the mind dispassionate towards the earth element. So when we talk about the earth element, this is obviously in the terminology of ancient India, not the terminology that we would use in scientific terms nowadays. And when we talk about the earth element, it doesn't mean that we're talking about actual earth, like actual dirt. What we're talking about is the quality of matter, matter that is solid. So matter that is not liquid, matter that is not gases. So solid matter, any kind of solid matter has the quality of the earth element, has the quality of being solid. And of course, there is solid matter inside our body and there's solid matter outside of our body. So the internal earth element and the external earth element, internal matter, solid matter, and external solid matter. And so we can go through our body and look at all the different parts that are all solid. And there's a whole list here: head hairs, body hairs, nails, teeth, skin, and the various internal organs and so on. And then we can see whatever is inside our body. Usually we cling to this. Usually we think this is ours. This is my body. We have some kind of emotional attachment to that kind of matter. And what is outside, to some of the things that are outside, we also cling because we think this is ours. Whatever, our glass of water, our headphones or whatever. So we like for some, but when we reflect about it properly, then we see this is all just matter. This is all just solid matter. It's all the same. It's all just atoms. It's entirely impersonal. The entire process is entirely impersonal. It has nothing to do with ourselves. So this is what the Buddha says here. We should see that both the internal solid matter, the internal earth element, and the external solid matter, the external earth element, they are simply earth element. They're simply solid matter. There's nothing personal there. There's no I there. There's no me there. There's no mine there. And this is the proper wisdom that we should develop when we do these kind of contemplations. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. It's an entirely impersonal process. And when you see this as it actually is with proper wisdom, then you become disenchanted towards solid matter, towards that earth element. And the mind becomes dispassionate towards solid matter. So we can let it go, we can become liberated from that clinging, from that perception of I or mine or me. So this is the way we develop wisdom. We don't, what is called here, not neglect wisdom, towards the earth element. And then the Buddha continues with the water element. And what bhikkhu is the water element? The water element may be either internal or external. What is the internal water element? Whatever internally belonging to oneself is water, watery, or clung to, that is bile, phlegm, pus, blood, sweat, fat, tears, grease, spittle, snot, oil of the joints, urine, or whatever else internally belonging to oneself is water, watery, and clung to. This is called the internal water element. Now, both the internal water element and the external water element are simply water element. And that should be seen as it actually is with proper wisdom thus. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. When one sees it thus, as it actually is with proper wisdom, one becomes disenchanted with the water element and makes the mind dispassionate towards the water element. So here, when we talk about water element, of course, we are again not talking about actual water. Just as in the case of the earth element, we're not talking about actual earth, about actual dirt. So water element just refers to the liquid state of matter. So that could obviously be water in a liquid state, but it could be any other kind of matter that can be liquid. For example, that can be oil. It could be, I think alcohol is liquid. I think even things like mercury is liquid. Like any kind of liquids have that quality of being liquid. And in ancient Indian terms, that is what they call water element, even though it doesn't necessarily contain actual water. So again, the Buddha says there's water, there is liquid stuff inside our body, liquid matter inside our body called water element here. And then, of course, there's also external in the outside world, liquid matter. And whatever is inside our body is usually what we cling to, what we think is me or mine, belongs to ourselves. And again, there's a whole list here of different liquidy things, such as blood, such as sweat, tears, and so on. And again, we are developing our wisdom by realizing that both internally and externally, all this is just liquid matter. It's entirely impersonal, has nothing to do with me or with mine or with myself. And as we develop wisdom in this way, we become disenchanted with liquid matter, and the mind becomes dispassionate, and then we can let it go and become liberated from that kind of clinging. And then we come to the fire element. What bhikkhu is the fire element? The fire element may be either internal or external. What is the internal fire element? Whatever internally belonging to oneself is fire, fiery and clung to. That is, that by which one is warmed, ages and is consumed, and that by which what is eaten, drunk, consumed and tasted gets completely digested, or whatever else internally belonging to oneself is fire, fiery and clung to. This is called the internal fire element. Now, both the internal fire element and the external fire element are simply fire element. And that should be seen as it actually is with proper wisdom thus. This is not me, this I am not, this is not myself. When one sees it thus, as it actually is with proper wisdom, one becomes disenchanted with the fire element and makes the mind dispassionate towards the fire element. So here now we are talking about the fire element. The next element, of course, that's coming up is the air element. And I think if we were going through this in modern terminology, we would probably have discussed the air element first and then the fire element. The air element is all the things that are in all the matter that is in the shape of a gas. So gases matter. Again, it's not necessarily just air, not necessarily just oxygen and nitrogen. Anything that is in the form of a gas would come under air element. And then the fire element is the energy that is necessary to change matter from one state to the next. For example, if you have an ice cube, you add some energy, you add some heat. That will so an ice cube obviously is earth element because it's solid. If you add some heat, it will change into liquid, into an actual water, liquid water. So then it becomes water element. If you add more heat, so more fire element, then eventually it will become water vapor. So it becomes air element, so a gas. So fire element is what transforms things from one state to the other, or also what transforms matter, even if it remains, for example, solid, from one solid state to another solid state. For example, if you eat something, then it is food, but as it gets digested, it turns into feces. So that process is also connected with the fire element. So in modern terms of physics, we would probably call this some kind of energy transformations. So here the text explains it's, for example, the physiological processes, chemical and physical processes that create body heat, that make the body age, that make digestion proper digestion possible, and so on. This is what we see internally as the fire element. And again, this might be what we cling to, and we go through the same reflections with proper wisdom, seeing that this is not me, this is not mine, this is not myself, and both internally and externally, it's the same kind of processes. It's the same kind of impersonal occurrences that keep on going on. Nothing to do with any kind of self. And as we develop wisdom, we become disenchanted, dispassionate, and then can let go of the clinging to the fire element. And then finally, air element, I've already explained. The Buddha says, what bhikkhu is the air element? The air element may be either internal or external. What is the internal air element? Whatever internally belonging to oneself is air, airy and clung to. That is, upgoing winds, downgoing winds, winds in the belly, winds in the bowels, winds that curse through the limbs, in-breath and out-breath, or whatever else internally belonging to oneself is air, airy, and clung to. This is called the internal air element. Now, both the internal air element and the external air element are simply air element. And that should be seen as it actually is with proper wisdom thus. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. When one sees it thus as it actually is with proper wisdom, one becomes disenchanted with the air element and makes the mind dispassionate towards the air element. So air element, as I mentioned, refers to any state of matter that is in the shape of a gas. And we can observe this in our body as the in-breath, the out-breath, various kinds of gases that come up through the mouth during digestions or that go down. So these are the most common forms of gas that we can observe in the body. Usually we don't cling to that too much, but in some way you could still cling to it, I guess, thinking about my breath or something. And the idea of winds coursing through the limbs, I think this is a little bit unusual maybe in modern terms. We can think of this as the oxygen that is transported through the bloodstream, if you want to interpret it in this way. So these are all the different kinds of gases that the body is producing. And again, we reflect with proper wisdom. This is an impersonal process, inside as outside. And then we develop the wisdom and we can let go of the clinging towards the air element. And then finally, we come to the space element. What, Bhikkhu, is the space element? The space element may be either internal or external. What is the internal space element? Whatever internally belonging to oneself is space, spatial, and clung to, that is the holes of the ears, the nostrils, the door of the mouth, and that aperture whereby what is eaten, drunk, consumed, and tasted gets swallowed, and where it collects and whereby it is excreted from below, or whatever else internally belonging to oneself is space, spatial, and clung to. This is called the internal space element. Now, both the internal space element and the external space element are simply space element. And that should be seen as it actually is with proper wisdom thus. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. When one sees it thus as it actually is with proper wisdom, one becomes disenchanted with the space element and makes the mind dispassionate towards the space element. So here now, sometimes the space element can be confused with the air element, but these are actually two entirely different things. The air element actually refers to a state of matter, anything that is in the shape of a gas, anything that's gases. But space element doesn't actually refer to matter. That refers to what is in between the matter, like the emptiness in between the matter. So in modern in terms of modern physics, we can think of this, for example, in the, like on the large scale, in the cosmos, in our galaxies or in our solar system, we know that there is the sun and there are a few planets, but mostly the vast majority is empty space, is the vacuum. And only because the vacuum is there, can all the sun and the planets be arranged in a certain way, and the planets can circle around the sun, and only because that is there can matter actually form and life is possible, and not everything is just lumped together in one big block. We need that space to actually arrange matter in meaningful ways and to actually create the structures of matter and make life possible. And also on the microscopic scale, when we look at atoms, for example, we know that there are subatomic particles, there is a core, a tiny core, and then even much more tiny electrons that are kind of flying around that core. But again, 99.999% of that atom is empty space. And we need that empty space in order to create meaningful structures and to build up molecules and again, to make meaningful create meaningful matter that can interact with each other and build all the structures that we see in our daily life. So space, that is what in modern terms we can think of as space element. Of course, when the Buddha talks about the internal space element, we could reflect about all the atoms in our body and all the space that is there. We can also do it the way the Buddha suggested here, as thinking about the various holes in our body, the ears, the nostrils, the mouth, and various other openings. If we do that, then we just need to be very clear that we are thinking about the opening itself. We're not thinking about the gas that is filling that opening. We're not thinking about the air that is filling those openings. Like, for example, when we think about the mouth, of course, there's an opening, but usually there's air in that opening, so it's kind of filled up. But that would be air element. That wouldn't be space element if we think about it that way. So it's very clear that we think about kind of like the geometrical structure, not the actual content of that whole. So to make sure that we're thinking about the empty space, not the matter that fills it up. So the time is progressing very slowly, very, very quickly. So I think for today we should end at this point and finish the sutta next time. So just to recap briefly, today we have looked at the first half of the sutta, and we are talking about 4 foundations, which is not neglecting wisdom, preserving truth, cultivating relinquishment, and training for peace. And of those 4 foundations, we have now started talking about the first one, which is not neglecting wisdom. And as we are talking about not neglecting wisdom, we are going through practices that have to do with the 6 elements. And we have now talked about the first 5 elements. And next time we will pick up with the consciousness element. Once we've talked about that, we will have finished the part of not neglecting wisdom. And then we are talking about the other 3 foundations: preserving truth, cultivating relinquishment, and training for peace. So that's what's going to come up next week, I guess. And for today, we are going to end reading now. And if you have any questions or comments, then please type them in the chat and I will see if I can answer them. So I just go through. I see a lot of comments, but so far I don't see any question. Seems I see a lot of emojis, so I think a lot of people enjoyed this sutta, and yeah, I think it is really one of the most beautiful suttas. Of course, all suttas are beautiful, but this is one of the most beautiful ones, in my opinion. And we have Buddha Nanda Mahatero, Venerable. Nice to see you. Welcome. Thank you for joining. And they say, sadhu, 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 Buddhism is sila, samadhi, and panya. Vipassana meditation is very important. Appreciation to you. So yes, Vipassana, definitely the techniques that we are talking about here in the sutta seem to be more on the Vipassana side than the samadhi side. So all these contemplations and reflections seem to be on the Vipassana side. And also, as you mentioned, Buddhism is sila, samadhi, and panya. And the Buddha doesn't seem to talk too much about sila and samadhi in this sutta. He's really just focusing on panya. And I think the reason for this is that Pukasati has such strong practice from the past life that he doesn't need to do any preliminary practices. He's such an accomplished practitioner that the Buddha just needs to give him that last bit of knowledge that he hasn't understood yet to let him break through and attain the higher stages on the path. So usually when the Buddha meets a new person and who isn't Buddhist yet, or who has come in contact with a Buddhist monastic for the first time, the Buddha will teach about the gradual training, and he give preliminary practices, teaching about giving and generosity and about the devas. And then only when he sees that the mind of that person is ready, he would even start about teaching the Four Noble Truths and deeper teachings. But because Pukusati is so advanced, he brings such good karma from the past life, it's not necessary for the Buddha at this point to do that. So the Buddha can straight away go to extremely deep teachings and help Pukusati with one single teaching to attain. As we will see in the end, he attains the stage of anagami, non-return. So, of course, the Buddha doesn't want to waste Pukusati's time teaching stuff that he doesn't need to learn anymore, teaching those preliminary things. The Buddha sees that he can give these very, very deep teachings straight away. And I think that is the reason, even though the path, of course, is Sila Samadhi Panya, this sutta mainly focuses on Panya. So Gita says, Aya, we believe that Gautama Buddha was aware of Pukusati was staying in that place with his Iddhi powers. What are your thoughts? I'm aware of that interpretation. I know this is very popular. But when we read the sutta, I think that is not the impression that we get. I think the Buddha is genuinely interested to learn about Pukusati. I think it seems that they meet by chance, and the Buddha is impressed by the way Pukusati is practicing. That is what the sutta itself tells us. And of course, we know that the commentaries, they have a tendency to glorify everything, to make everything more miraculous. So the commentaries always tell us that the Buddha knew everything in advance, and that the Buddha always used his mind-reading powers to know everything. But when we read the sutta, if we just take the sutta seriously, then the sutta tells us the Buddha and Pukusati were meditating together, and the Buddha was impressed by what he saw. And because the Buddha liked the way Pukusati was conducting himself, he thought he was a person that was worthy of interacting with, and he started to ask questions. So I think, I know that interpretation. I know that some people even say the Buddha flew all the way from Savatthi to Rajagaha with his magical powers just to talk to Pukusati. And the whole story becomes very, very magical. But I think what is so beautiful about the story is actually that it is so simple, and that the Buddha just met Pukusati and decided to give him a teaching without there needing to be all these miracles and all these supernatural events. I think the beauty of the story is that it is so simple, that it doesn't need all these magical things. And Piti Sukha says, as we train, this is not me, this is not I, me, or mine. We should see nothing as mine at all. I think that's what this means. So basically everything arising in this consciousness is absolutely impersonal. Yes, exactly. That's the Buddha's teaching of non-self. So yeah, anything, whether it's the matter or the consciousness, is entirely impersonal. So obviously we have not talked about the consciousness element so far. We will do that next week because the sutta is too long. So then we will go through this in detail. But yes, that is correct. Nothing at all should be seen as personal. Everything is non-self. That's one of the three basic characteristics of every experience in samsara, which is impermanence and unsatisfactoriness, dukkha, and then anatta, non-self. And Gita says, we believe Buddha wanted to help him on the path. Yeah, that is true. Definitely the Buddha wanted to help him on the path. But whether the Buddha needed to work a lot of miracles and read the mind and fly through the air is a different story. Or whether this was a much more simple event, as it is usually when we read the early texts, the stories there are much more simple. And when we read the commentaries, everything becomes much more magical and much more elaborate. So that's a general pattern. And some people are more drawn to all the magical events in the commentaries, and some people just are much more drawn to the simplicity of the early texts. So there can also be personal preferences there, I think. And Sam says, Aya, why do you think Pukasati starts listening to another teacher's teaching, since he already regarded the Blessed One as a teacher and he does not know the one in front of him is actually the Buddha? I think this was very common back in the day. I think Pukasati is just being friendly. And we know that back in the day, it was very common for ascetics of different religious groups or different movements to come together and to share their teachings. And sometimes they would have debates to try to determine which teaching is better. But sometimes they were just trying to learn from each other. And in the same way that nowadays people learn from different teachers. Even if you learn from different Buddhist teachers, different teachers can teach in different ways. And sometimes that can just be helpful to gain a deeper understanding. But in this particular case, I think Pukasati was just being polite. There was somebody, like he was sharing the space with someone else. They had just started a conversation. That other person, of course, the Buddha, but he doesn't know that the Buddha had asked him about his background, who is your teacher, and what Dhamma does that person profess, and so on. So he let Pukasati share a little bit of his background, and now it's kind of polite that Pukasati would also listen a little bit to the other person sharing their teaching. Of course, it turns out that this is the Buddha, so it was perfect for Pukasati. But I think in that beginning stage, Pukasati was just being polite. Having talked about himself just now, he's now listening to the other person. And I don't think that that was unusual back then. So we have other suttas. For example, there is the Ratavinita Sutta, which is, I think, Majjhima Nikaya number 24. And that is a very similar case where Sariputta is going incognito to another very outstanding Buddhist monk who is called Punnamantaniputta, the monk who is foremost in teaching Dhamma. And Punna doesn't know that he's talking to Sariputta. Punna thinks he's just talking to some random ascetic. And because he doesn't know this is Sariputta, he gives him a very, very detailed Dhamma teaching. And at the end, he figures out that this is Sariputta. And then he says, oh, if I had known that you're Sariputta, I would never have taught because you know much more than I do. And Sariputta is just so happy and says, I just love listening to the Dhamma so much. I was just so happy that you gave me the teaching. So I think it was kind of normal for people to, even though they're not from the same spiritual group, to go to each other and listen to each other's Dhamma. And AS says, can we view the space between our bodies and all else as filled with what connects us to all what we see, all elements in their process? Not sure this thought makes sense. So space actually just, the space element is not filled with anything. Like, we shouldn't overcomplicate the whole thing. Space element just means that, like the literal space that gives matter the ability to move around, to connect, that so that atoms can connect, so that structures can form. So don't overcomplicate this with thinking that there's something that fills us, that connects us, because then it's very easy to kind of introduce some kind of cosmic consciousness or some kind of transpersonal consciousness through the back door. So space is really just space. Try not to overcomplicate these things. So, and what you say, all elements in their process, in some way you can think about it that way, because of course, in order to transform from one thing to the other, from one state to another state, there needs to be space for things to actually make changes. So in order for things to be changeable, for things to be impermanent, we need space so that matter can change from one state to another state. And Sunya Anagarika I think this is Tara, used to be Tara, it seems like, from your picture. So nice to see you. I didn't realize that your name is Sunya now. And I'm really, really happy to see that you got Anagarika ordination. Congratulations. And thanks for joining in. And she says, when we see this earth element, does this mean reflecting on what we know from past experience to be solid, like our bones? Or is it more a physical investigation? So I think this can be both. Like the Buddha is for example, the Buddha says the elements can be internal and external, but then he only gives an explanation of how to contemplate the internal earth element, like going through the body, the various parts of the body that are solid. And I think that is because what is in the body, that's what we can directly feel, what we can directly experience. What is outside, we can see that, and of course, if we go there, we can touch it, but we don't experience it, especially if we meditate, if we don't move around, we don't experience it with the same immediacy as we can with our own body. So in some ways, we can directly experience it as being solid. And of course, then that makes a bigger impact on the mind than if we just think about it or reflect on it. But also, of course, the reflecting on it part is also very important, because that's how we contemplate, that's how we develop the wisdom. And for some of the elements, especially the space element, this isn't something we can actually directly experience. This is more something that we conceptualize and that we kind of reflect on, rather than a physical investigation, because it's not possible to physically feel space, like the hole in the ear or the opening of the mouth. It's not possible to feel that. So it can be both ways. And I think the most successful way of practicing it is to actually combine the two, like the physical experience, because that makes it much more immediate, and also the reflection about it. And now I see a lot of people saying sadhu, sadhu, and thank you. And I think that was the last question. And we've also gone 2 minutes over time. So I think it's time to wrap up. Next time we will finish the sutta. And for now, we can end with 3 sadhus. Feel free to join in if you like. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And I'll see you all either on Thursday or next Tuesday. Have a nice day.